Okay, let's dive in. Imagine you could tap into the absolute cutting edge of AI weather forecasting, predicting, I don't know, everything from rainfall to how damp the soil is. But, and here's the kicker, without needing some kind of massive supercomputer humming away in your basement. That's the really revolutionary idea we're exploring today.
Yeah, and it tackles a big problem. See, these huge AI models, people often call them foundation models, they're incredibly smart, no doubt, but they are also incredibly expensive. And, well, they soak up resources like nobody's business when you try to adapt them for something new.
Right, especially in weather, right? Like if you want to teach an existing model about a new variable, how much water is evaporating or predicting rainfall amounts precisely.
Exactly. That usually means this massive, really costly retraining process. You're basically starting over in many ways, tweaking the whole giant thing.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this pretty groundbreaking study. They found a surprisingly lightweight way, almost frugal, you could say, to add new skills to a top-tier weather model called Aurora. And you're going to find out how these researchers basically found a shortcut, how they unlocked new predictions for weather stuff the model wasn't originally built for, saving just tons of time and, importantly, compute power.
And, this is where it gets really fascinating because the accuracy of these new predictions, how well they worked, it actually tells us something pretty deep about the knowledge hidden inside these huge AI models, almost like how they implicitly get the physics of the world around us.
Okay, let's set the scene properly. What exactly is a foundation model, especially when we're talking about weather? Can you break that down?
Sure, so in AI generally, a foundation model is, well, it's basically any big model that's been trained on really broad data, usually tons of it, often using self-supervision techniques. And the key is that this base model can then be adapted, maybe fine-tuned, for a whole range of different specific tasks later on. Think of it like a really smart apprentice who's learned a lot, generally ready to specialize.
But for weather and climate, there's a crucial twist compared to, say, AI for language or images.
Precisely, yeah, that's a key difference. Unlike those other fields, weather foundation models absolutely have to encode real, meaningful statistical links between the physical variables. Things like temperature, air pressure, wind speed. Yeah. Because the data they learn from is those physical values. It's not just about spotting visual patterns. It's about grasping the physics baked into the data.
Gotcha. And Aurora, that's the model they used in this study, the current state-of-the-art one.
That's the one. Aurora is considered right at the forefront of weather foundation models.
So they have this incredibly powerful Aurora model, but the challenge is teaching this genius model new tricks without completely breaking the bank, resource-wise. What was the clever workaround they found?
Right. That's the absolute core innovation here. Instead of the usual path, fine-tuning the whole massive 1.3 billion parameter Aurora model, changing its inputs, its outputs, retraining everything, they came up with this really lightweight approach.
Lightweight, okay. So how did that work? Did they still have to mess with the original Aurora?
Nope, that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
They kept the original super powerful Aurora model completely frozen, just as it was pre-trained. Then they add small, separate components on top, specifically things called multi-layer perceptrons, or MLPs. You can think of them as small, dedicated neural networks. And these little decoders were trained only using Aurora's internal latent space representation.
Okay, latent space. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, it sounds jargony, but think of it like this. Aurora processes all this complex weather data, right? And in doing so, it builds up this highly compressed, deep sort of encoded understanding of how all the different weather variables relate to each other. That condensed understanding, that's its latent space. The core idea, the hypothesis really, was that this latent space already contains those essential physical relationships. So you don't need to reteach Aurora the physics.
Ah, I see. So you're just teaching these small decoders how to read or translate that existing knowledge for a new purpose, like predicting evaporation.
Exactly. It's like Aurora built this incredibly detailed library of weather physics knowledge, and the decoders are just small, specialized librarians trained to find the right information for a new question.
That is clever, and I bet the practical payoffs were pretty big.
Oh, absolutely. Huge. This decoder method slashed training time by 50%, half the time. And it used about 35% less memory, too, which, really lowers the barrier. It makes advanced weather AI much more accessible. You don't necessarily need that national-level supercomputer anymore. Smaller labs, maybe even specific communities, could potentially use these kinds of tools.
Okay, so they've got this efficient new method. What did they actually try to predict with it? What were these unseen variables they tested on?
They went for things Aurora hadn't explicitly learned during its initial training. A lot of hydrological variables, things like potential evaporation, runoff from rainfall, soil moisture levels, and importantly, precipitation itself, which is notoriously tricky to predict accurately. Plus, things like energy fluxes at the surface, heat, radiation.
And how did it do? Were the results? Hmm, Well, were they any good? Especially for stuff Aurora hadn't technically seen before.
They were surprisingly good. Really eye-opening, actually. For potential evaporation and soil moisture, for instance, the decoders hit correlation coefficients over 0.95. That's excellent.
Wow.
And even for something really tough like precipitation, they showed real skill. A Pearson correlation coefficient of 0.71. Now, for precip, given how complex and spotty it can be, that's considered pretty strong. Impressive, really.
That is impressive for something learned indirectly. So the big takeaway isn't just, hey, it works, but the reason it works is that Aurora's underlying knowledge was already so physically grounded.
That's the real aha moment, yes. The success of the decoders wasn't random. It directly lined up with how strongly the new variable was physically linked to the original variables Aurora was trained on. Take potential evaporation. It's heavily driven by wind and temperature, things Aurora knew extremely well, so the decoder could latch onto those existing relationships relatively easily.
Okay, so it's not just finding patterns, it's tapping into something that reflects actual physical processes.
That's what it strongly suggests. Even precipitation, which is super complex, is ultimately tied to moisture moving around, which involves wind and humidity, variables Aurora understood from its training. So yeah, it really indicates that Aurora's latent space isn't just abstract math, it's encoding meaningful physical connections.
But presumably it wasn't perfect. Were there areas where this lightweight approach struggled a bit?
Oh sure, there were limitations. For variables that had a weaker link to the atmospheric stuff, Aurora was trained on, like, say, total water storage in the ground, which includes deep groundwater. The decoders found it much harder. Makes sense, right? And also for very fine-grained, complex things like precipitation, they did notice some visual artifacts, like slightly patchy predictions sometimes, which they think might be related to how Aurora's internal architecture works.
Still pretty remarkable. Did these decoders inherit other useful traits from the main Aurora model? Like, could they predict far ahead?
Yes, that was another plus. They inherited good stability, what's called autoregressive stability. That means they could make forecasts several days out without the predictions going haywire. For example, the paper showed they could anticipate the heavy rain from a specific storm, Cyclone Alex, up to 6 days in advance. Now that's hugely valuable for things like flood warnings, even if they sometimes slightly underestimated the absolute peak rainfall.
Okay, 6 days is significant for preparedness. So let's talk competition. How did this frugal decoder approach stack up against the alternative, actually fine-tuning the entire massive Aurora model, or even against other big weather models out there?
Right, the comparison is key. They did compare it to Aurora Plus A, which is the version where they did fine-tune the full 1.3 billion parameters. And Aurora Plus A, the full fine-tuned one, often did get slightly better scores for some specific things like peak runoff or soil moisture accuracy.
But at a much higher cost.
Exactly. Training Aurora Plus was twice as slow. Twice.
Mm-hmm.
And needed way more powerful GPU memory. So you get maybe a marginal accuracy bump for a massive increase in resource cost.
That's a significant trade-off. And what about other models? Not just Aurora plus Mac.
That's maybe even more telling. These lightweight decoders, despite being, well, lightweight, held their own. They were competitive with, and in many cases actually outperformed, other well-known AI weather models like GraphCast or Frusi, and they were even competitive with traditional numerical weather prediction systems, like the ECMWF's IFS model, which is a global standard. So they're not just a neat trick, they're genuinely useful in a real-world context.
Okay, so wrapping this up then. What's the big picture here? It sounds like we've learned we don't always need the sledgehammer approach of retraining these enormous AI models completely just to teach them new tricks.
That's the core message, I think. By cleverly tapping into that rich, physically aware, latent space that a model like Aurora already built, we can predict a whole bunch of new weather variables with, frankly, astonishing efficiency.
Which feels like a really big step towards making this powerful AI weather forecasting tech more, well, more democratic, maybe, more accessible.
Definitely more accessible, more frugal, as the study puts it. It opens doors for smaller research groups, maybe startups, potentially even local communities or regions, to leverage these advanced tools without needing that state-level supercomputing infrastructure. It really helps push the broader use of AI in earth sciences forward by lowering that barrier to entry quite dramatically.
And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it, if these foundation models are already implicitly understanding these complex physical links just from their initial training, what other unseen processes, maybe beyond weather, might they be encoding? What else could we potentially unlock just by figuring out the right lightweight decoder to ask the right kind of question? Makes you think, right?